Hey everyone, this is episode 9 of Keeping Democracy Alive. Excited to be back. My name's Rem. I'm a rising junior at Tufts University, majoring in international relations, focusing on globalization. Um, I work in Tufts Hillel. I'm doing the Cummings Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Programming, and through that initiative, I've been honored to um, pursue this series, which is pretty much what the title says. It's highlighting figures in the community and throughout America who are often overlooked for the work that they're doing to keep democracy alive and help create and or sustain a just society. Um, and so this week I'm featuring Jeff Hicks, a local real estate agent here in Atlanta. I'm doing a lot of interesting work in terms of ensuring that housing is affordable, communities are representative of the people that live within it, and that generally architects are creating sustainable developments. I, I think I've met you before, right, Jeff? I think I've met you once in person. Uh,
Yes, you have.
yeah, I was younger for sure, but
Yeah, you
I
look
met
good.
him through my dad. My dad's an architect here in Atlanta, and my dad and Jeff together um, have, I'm sure, plenty of talks about the things that I just mentioned, um, and are actually working to ensure that we are more introspective about the way that we pursue building. So I'm gonna let Jeff introduce himself, the things that he's doing, and then we can get into our conversation for this week.
All right. Well, thank you, Rem. I'm very happy to be invited to share with you on this podcast.
Thank you.
My name is Jeffery Hicks. I'm a local real estate broker here in Atlanta, focused on the sale of single-family homes and land, and I do some commercial real estate as well. I've been a part of and I'm very active in my local real estate trade association. I'm a part of two. One is the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, which is the oldest and largest minority real estate trade association in the country. It's founded in 1947, and it was founded out of a need to address uh, segregated housing conditions in this country in residential real estate. And the motto of that organization is democracy in housing. I also serve as part of a largest trade association in this country, which is the National Association of Realtors. I currently serve as the vice chair of the Realtors Fair Housing Public Policy Committee. So I have committed myself as a professional to try to make sure that uh, fair and equitable housing is available to all Americans, regardless of race, creed, or color, or sexual orientation, or disabilities, source of income. And I believe that the cornerstone of all communities is a family's ability to have safe, affordable, decent housing in the neighborhood of their choice.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's in a nutshell what I'm about, really.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. So before Jeff and I got in contact, and pretty much what Jeff really wanted me to watch for this interview, if you don't mind me saying, was this video narrated by Richard Rothstein. Richard Rothstein is he a professor, Jeff?
Retired professor, researcher that lives in San Francisco. I think that's the city he lives in.
Hmm.
And I was first exposed to Richard Rothstein back in 2018. Invited him out to speak at a conference that my organization hosted at the Congressional Black Caucus, and I was really inspired by a book that he wrote called The Color of Law,
Yeah.
which basically explained how the federal government played a very central role in segregating America.
Yeah. And that's what this video is about, pretty much. I think it's Richard Rothstein's attempt in understanding that not every American is going to read a book, unfortunately, and it's his attempt to uh, appeal to an audience probably around my age who would prefer to just watch a video and get like a quick synopsis of what is happening in America. So yeah, let's talk about that if you don't mind. I was saying this to you before we started recording, right? Um, my goal with this series in general, not just talking to you, is to learn a history and learn from people, but mainly to learn things that otherwise I wouldn't be taught, specifically in the education system. And I think that what Richard is talking about in terms of um, the housing market in America is something that most people don't even know about. And I don't think that that has to do with specifically race. I think that just has to do with our government specifically trying to push these to the side, right? This history to the side. So I think it's important to highlight that right now with you. Um, so something that struck me when I was watching that video, Jeff, was, and this is something I talked about with my dad, is I think right now a lot of pundits from both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, are trying to put a blame on the other person, right? They're trying to say, we're in this situation because a Republican did this, or we're in this situation because a Democrat did this. And I think that that's a very counterproductive way of analyzing the situation we're in. And I think that Democrats often feel as if they are in the right to blame the Republicans, and Republicans vice versa. But I think what this video is really highlighting, and feel free to disagree with me, Jeff, is Lyndon B. Johnson was just as much a part of the problem as any other Republican, and Clinton made mistakes too, and even Obama made mistakes in his his term, and so yeah, I think that I'm curious to hear if you would agree that this isn't the situation that we're in is not a problem of Democrats versus Republican, but rather of the system, of the government making a lot of mistakes. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. I don't know if anything of what I've just said kind of triggered anything in your head about what you wanted to say, but I'll let you.
Well, let me say this. America has a long checkered history when it comes to disenfranchisement of people from land. I like to always start with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, where there was an act of Congress where the Native American was forcibly removed from their land, forced out west onto reservations. Then you had in America something called the Homestead Act, where this country gave away millions of acres to any what they called citizen of this country, which did not include Black people or Native Americans, and allowed them to gave them land, gave over millions of acres, and allowed them to develop that land. And they were entitled to do that as long as they had not been accused of any type of insurrection in this country. And when you think about that, when you have a group of white Americans that got a head start like that, that creates in and of itself an economic disparity that can't be made up in hundreds of years. And then we're living in a country that enslaved races of people to help them develop an economic system to develop land and develop enterprises. And so when you look at what has taken place in this country as it relates to the disparities between whites and blacks and other ethnic groups, it's all based around economics.
Yeah.
You know, it's based around the fact that uh, land and the development of it is extremely important. It's a part of our economic system in this country. You know, you right now are sitting on a piece of land, you know, in your home.
Yeah.
Every corporation, whether it's in an office building, a warehouse, or whatever, we all, the land is underneath all of us. And so the European, when they came to this country, they have exploited that for centuries. And those centuries of exploitation have created vast disparities among racial groups or ethnic groups that you ask yourself, as we look at this change that's taking place in this country, or this awareness now as it relates to racial prejudice that exists in this country, if by law, and it's through an economic system, a systemic way of doing business in this country, especially if by law now, and the reason why I say by law is because when you begin to understand laws in this country that created systemic economic disparities, if the same federal, local government created laws that created disparities, I think it's incumbent upon those same entities, federal, state, local, municipalities, to correct the disparities that they've created over time. And that's a very difficult thing
Yeah.
to figure out how to do.
Yeah.
But we have to create a system of equality, because at the end of the day, if racism was used to create an economic advantage, which basically decreases competition. You know, you don't have to compete with me. You know, if you're a white guy, or if you're a white offspring, doesn't have to compete with a black guy, because the system doesn't has racial hiring practices, lack of lending practices, health disparities, all type of disparities. If those type of systems exist in a nation and it decreases competition, then you will always have an advantage, you know. And so we have to think about, how do we create equality?
Yeah.
You know, and that's what this country seems to be very nervous about, because people that are in power and people who have enjoyed privilege, they're not open. Many of them, they're not open to equality, because they have benefited from a system that gives them an economic advantage through racial practices.
Yeah.
And prejudice.
What are you doing in terms of how do you and the various boards that you're on interact with one another when you're in meetings? To, like, you're saying it takes a lot of research. There's not an answer that we have right now, right? So are you guys thinking like every time you meet, are you guys trying to talk about different strategies? What are you guys doing?
Mhm. Well, one of the things that our organization, I'm going to say the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, have always been focused on is helping to change policy and helping to expand diversity and inclusion initiatives in legislation, within companies, within agencies,
Mm-hmm.
and to try to create more opportunities for other ethnic groups to participate in the economic system in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And you take commercial real estate here in Atlanta, trillions of dollars in commercial real estate is sold annually, and billions of dollars in commissions are earned by real estate brokers.
Yeah.
If you was to ask, but less than one half of 1% of those fees are earned by Black brokers. And when you look at government contracting, of all the contracts, the trillions of dollars of business that the federal government does in buying services globally, and you look at the contracts that are awarded to companies, less than probably 2 to 3% of those contracts are owned by are awarded to minority businesses. And so, and then when you look at, so that's especially in federal contracting, and that level of disparity exists on the federal level, state level, and in local municipalities, and certainly when you start going in these rural areas, in these rural and small towns. I mean, it's pathetic. So to answer your question, so what we recognize is that there has to be policy change and laws have to change in order for society to change, because the civil rights gains that occurred in this nation, it did not occur because white people went to Sunday school one Sunday and the Lord convicted their hearts and said, we need to do the right thing.
Mm.
Change happened in this country because we focus on addressing law. And if you don't change the law in the nation, then you're not going to change the outcomes that was going to happen. And so we've always been focused on policy change, legislative change, and advocating for that.
When did just for the viewer, I should honestly know this, but when did these practices of redlining um, and contract buying, as mentioned by Richard Rothstein, and all these various um, malignant practices in the real estate world, when did they start to fizzle out? I know that they still exist, right? Like it's still very prevalent. We see it with gentrification all over America, but legally, when did they supposedly fizzle out of the real estate arena?
Well, you've accurately stated they haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah, they still exist, but if you was to, but to answer your question, when did things start to improve? Let's say.
Yeah, I guess that's a better way of asking it.
Yeah. And so I would say that the tide probably began to change in the 1960s, and specifically when it came to practices as it relate to housing, it was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which is just 52 years ago now,
Yeah.
that the federal government passed a law that that outlawed, or it's against the law to uh, 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 to deny a person a loan, to deny a person the right to buy a house in a specific neighborhood based upon race, was something that was outlined in the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
But did that really prevent that from?
Occurring? See, no, it didn't, because it's one thing to have laws, and it's another thing to have enforcement of laws. So although the law was on the books, remember that law was really the Fair Housing Act of 1968. I mean, you got to go all the way back to the 13th Amendment of 1865 to when that was really implemented, but it wasn't enforced because you had all these Jim Crow laws that went into effect for over 100 years. But redlining and all these type of things and these practices, unfortunately, they still persisted. Probably up until rampantly up until the 1980s, you know. And so, and I say 1980s because, you know, I graduated from high school in 1982. But looking back on it now, that's almost 40 years ago. So when you start looking back at the history of the country, especially when you start looking at what's going on today, and companies acknowledging, man, so many companies acknowledging, the NFL and all these other larger corporations acknowledging that they will not tolerate, you know, racial injustice and stuff anymore. Man, it's 2020, you know, and you're just now recognizing that perhaps your culture was discriminatory toward Black people or minorities, period.
Mm.
And then when you look at the challenges that we have in this country over immigration, you know, we really have a system in America that, unfortunately, the history of it, you just have a system where it's like a caste system. You know, it's a system where you have a group of people that feel that they're superior to another group. You know, and that term white supremacy is a very powerful word because, you know, for me as a human to feel that I am superior to you because I'm of another ethnic race, to me, that's a very scary and psychotic, crazy way of thinking.
Yeah.
And you know, from your ethnic group, I mean, you know, a Jewish, being you know, a Jewish person, the history of discrimination that Jews have suffered for thousands of years is for hundreds of years is you know, the Black community really identifies with that.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I obviously want to talk more about housing specifically, but I think that this conversation can go beyond that. I mean, for me, it's, I don't know. I've always been under the impression, even at like the age of 16, I'd learn about the civil rights era and I'd be like, that's only 50 some odd years ago. Like, why are we talking about it as if it's super, super long ago? It's really not. And how much is really changing over 50 years, you know? I think that obviously we've improved to an extent as a society, but yeah, I'm with you. It's 2020, and I don't know. And the crazy thing, Jeff, is like, as a white person, I can say this to like, there's still plenty of white people, even Jewish people, which is also a crazy thing to me. In my last interview, I talked with my brother's partner, and we're talking about white nationalism versus white supremacy. And for me, exactly like your point, like, as a Jew, I feel like every Jew should kind of be understanding of the situation and of the pleas of Black people around America right now. And the fact that they aren't, despite our history, is very confusing to me. But there's still people who aren't understanding. They aren't empathetic. I mean, it's scary when you see the NASCAR driver standing up for what he thinks is right and then finding a noose in his garage pit and people flying Confederate flags over NASCAR races, and then that's scary in of itself, right? And then it's equally scary for me to hear people then somehow not defend it, but like turn a blind eye, right? It's like, yeah, but that's just like a small little minority. Or, yeah, but like those people aren't the ones in politics. But that's such a not really educated perspective, in my opinion. I think, like, as we learned from Richard Rothstein, there's white supremacy isn't just like someone who is putting on a KKK fuck excuse me a KKK robe and going and lynching people, right? That's not the only example of white supremacy. White supremacy is also found in the political arena with um, undermining legislation that's supposed to be inclusive, or in banking when you're not giving loans to Black families, or in the NFL when you're specifically exploiting Black people and then silencing someone for using their rights to peacefully protest. Like, that's also white supremacy. But yeah, I'm again rambling, which is, I guess, habit of mine, I'm realizing. But yeah, I
That's
hear you.
okay.
I'm with you. I think for
Uh,
me though, Jeff, what's hard is, as a white person, there's like a constant struggle in figuring out how to be a good ally. You know, I don't want to overstep myself and be too loud. I also don't want to be obviously too quiet. Like, there's like this fine, not a like this is, I don't, do you hear that? Like,
well, let me ask you this question,
yeah,
Rem. I noticed you said as a white person,
yeah,
but you're Jewish. So, do you consider yourself a white person, or do
yeah,
you consider yourself a Jewish person that has white privilege?
yeah. So, interesting question. I'd say when you frame it like that, probably the second, but I don't think that they necessarily have to be disconnected, right? Like, when I was talking about things related to this with my dad, I brought up the point, like, first of all, as a Jew, as a Black person, you know this. If you were in Germany, if Jeff Hicks, the way you look, the way you are, everything about you the same, was in Germany in 1939, you too would have been in a concentration camp. Me and you both, we would have been in concentration camps.
Correct.
So it's not, obviously Jews were targeted, and the Holocaust, when you say the word the Holocaust, it's specifically referring to the Jews, but plenty of other people were persecuted during 1945. Obviously, anti-Semitism in World War II. Obviously, anti-Semitism has been prevalent for so long. But the thing is, right now, right? If I went to, I don't know, backcountry Georgia, or very eastern parts of Europe, or even like France, right? Like, I might look a little bit Jewish, but I'm white, right? Like, I'm able to walk around and people aren't going to be like, "Oh, that's a Jew." And then like talk bad things to me, or make me feel bad about myself, or scare me or intimidate me, right? You you can't hide your skin color, right? So for me, like, yeah, I think Judaism is a huge part of my identity, and I wouldn't necessarily be, if I'm asked about like what my identity is, I don't think white is going to come to mind first. So I guess my answer is the second thing. I'm a Jewish person with white privilege, but I think that's a huge caveat. I can hide. I could go to backcountry Georgia and be safe and feel safe. I could go for a jog. I could do what Ahmed Arbery was doing. Go for a jog. I could walk into my house and not have the cops called on me. because I'm white. So like I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. I know that we kind of flipped roles right there for a second. I don't know if that answers your question though.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering how you identify it, but I'm gonna say this. It's very interesting in this country that um, public accommodations was desegregated before housing was. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
You're talking about like bathrooms and
Public
water fountains.
accommodations, railroads. I mean, at one time, people, blacks riding on the back of the bus, black being in back of railroad cars, that type of thing. And even when you look at it, blacks and whites have been working together in forward plants and all type of working on jobs together. But what's interesting is those same blacks and whites that were working together in the 60s on jobs as jobs companies became desegregated, neighborhoods didn't. White people and black people can work together, but that they didn't live together.
Yeah.
They're not your neighbor. And there's a huge difference when when your neighbor is of a different race.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of white people that are not comfortable with that because I believe they clearly understand that when black children and white children live in the same neighborhood, go to the same schools, there is a high probability that those black girls and those white boys and black girls will begin to develop relationships with one
Yeah.
another.
No, yeah.
Okay. And begin to marry and have relationships and have children. And that's very scary for some white people.
I have a question.
Especially that's a very scary situation.
I have
Now,
a
I asked
question.
your father, let me make this
Yeah, yeah,
last
yeah. Go
statement
ahead.
that really impressed me about your dad. I asked your dad, I said, would you have an issue if your son married a black girl? And he told me, he said, I wouldn't. And I kept asking, I said, man, come on, tell me the truth. You would not have a problem if your son married a black. You know what he told me? He said, Jeffrey, it doesn't matter to me the person's skin color that my son marries. What matters to me is what they believe. And that always rings in my head. Now, so what's very important to your dad, though, is the Jewish culture, the
Yeah.
Jewish traditions. And he wants his children to understand and appreciate being Jewish.
Yeah.
And so I thought about that very deeply, but I said, So he wouldn't have an issue with a woman who doesn't try to destroy his son's faith in Judaism. And that's what was important to him more than the ethnicity of the individual.
Yeah.
I thought that was very, I don't
No,
know how
that's
common that
yeah.
is.
I think my dad's a really, really smart guy. I think.
Very,
I think he's constantly analyzing. I think I get this from him a little bit, but like he's always analyzing, very observant, and always thinking about just like the broader importance of life. And I
mhm,
think a lot of people miss that, right? Like a lot of people are thinking about themselves too often. They're thinking about how can I have the best life possible, right? Which ultimately might resort in I need to make a lot of money and do
right.
whatever it takes to make a lot of money so that I can live out my life the way that I want to live out my life. But for me, and I think my brothers, the way my parents raised us, and I think that this is pretty prevalent in Judaism. I can't speak for Black communities, I know you guys are very, very, there's a huge sense of pridefulness
Hmm.
and pride in the community. So I think that Jews and Black people have that in common. It's just more about, there's more to life than just making money, right? I'm not saying
Yeah.
every Jew is good, right? There's people who don't have the right outlook, but it's more about love and family and caring and leaving an impact and questioning and improving, right? Like it's not just about making $1 million doing a desk job where I'm analyzing numbers. Like that's not all it is.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that that's necessarily a problem. I think that those people are needed in society nowadays in certain manners, but that is just my perspective. Um, I wanted to say two things. I did want to ask you a question, and I hope that I don't sound I don't know. I hope that this isn't a bad question. I don't sound like dumb asking it, but do you think that Black people would want, like, if you do you have a daughter?
I do have a daughter.
Would you want her to marry a white guy? Would you care?
You
Would you
know,
prefer?
yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, I have this discussion with my kids quite a bit because their exposure of to other ethnic groups is much broader than the way I grew up,
Hmm,
and they're much more well traveled than I was at their age.
yeah,
Their friendships, uh, much more exposure than I had
yeah,
growing up. Mhm. And so, at the end of the day, you know, I love my daughter deeply. And because I understand relationships, you know, at my age, I'm most concerned. I have a daughter and a son. I'm more concerned about them finding someone that loves them,
yeah,
respects them, and treats them uh, respectfully than anything. Because if my daughter married a Black guy and he was abusive toward her, you know, I wound up in prison because I tried to kill him. And so if you ask me, would I rather have my daughter married to a Black man that's abusive? And I don't have to go to the extreme of
no, no,
abusive.
I'm hearing you. I just
Yeah,
thought,
I mean,
yeah,
I'm saying it could go that way. You know, if I had a preference, if I, you know, which and parents have no control of this. You know, my preference would say marry a Black man because I'm a Black man. I'm proud of who I am, and I want
yeah,
her to marry somebody like me.
yeah,
But when it comes to her life, well, I want more than her
exactly,
marrying somebody like me is for her to be happy and
yeah,
in a loving relationship. So if she
yeah.
found that in a white young man, I would be happy for her.
Jeff, we have maybe 10 minutes left, so I want to kind of turn this back to housing.
Okay,
For me, why I'm super interested, and people might not know this about me, I want to work with my dad after school. I'm
good.
really motivated and fascinated by the work that he's doing, the ideas he has. I really want to help him make them come true. I think that they
Mm,
would benefit communities. I think that they would just, yeah, whatever. Um, Part of the reason why is I drive around Atlanta, and again, for those of you who don't know, Atlanta is projected to grow by around 5 million people over like the next 10 years. Um,
that's cool.
and as a result, investors are buying and building everywhere. And I see, just in a 30-minute drive around Atlanta, I can, pretty much any direction I go, I'll find new townhome developments and new apartment developments and whatever. To me, they all look the same, right? And they're all catered towards a certain certain person. You know, they're catered. I don't want to put a race on it, but they're definitely they're all more expensive and they have like amenities. But what I wanted to talk to you about this. It's gentrification, right? It's gentrification. And I want you to explain to whatever listener is still listening at this point why it's important that we reimagine the way that we build and the way that we're impacting communities. Because just building apartment buildings and hoping to make the most money possible is not sustainable. So why is it important that we change? And this can be, you can answer this economically, you can answer this in terms of the importance of having a more inclusive society, a more sustainable and environmental friendly society. You can take this however you want, but I just want you as a professional to explain.
Okay, well, I'll try to be quick since we only have a few minutes left.
Okay.
When you live in a city that's projected with the type of population growth that you have, you're going to have to increase density. You're going to have to, this is the South, and normally you have owners have much larger lots of land, But if a city keeps growing and it welcomes that growth, then you're going to have to increase density, which means you have to have more improvements, more buildings on smaller pieces of land. So that's the catch-22 of that. And when it comes to gentrification, as a property owner, every property owner wants to see their values increase.
Yeah.
So as we see homes, I live in a neighborhood where I bought the house I'm currently sitting in now and I live in. I bought it from my family. My mother's brothers and sisters. I paid $60,000 for it. And within a block, not even a block, I mean, I'm talking about 4 to 5, 3 houses being built, 4 or 5 houses down the street from me. I mean, literally 4 or 5 driveways down the street from me. And each one of those houses are going to be sold for no less than $600,000. And they're small houses being compacted on small lots. The problem with gentrification is that it's not a bad thing for property values to increase. The negative thing about gentrification is that longtime residents that lived in a community for years without amenities all of a sudden are displaced and can no longer live in that community as rising property values go up. I live near a Kroger that I walk to get my groceries. Those ladies, these essential, quote unquote, essential workers that work in that Kroger, that ring up my groceries and that bake, fry, that serve that store, they can't pay $600,000 for a house. But many of them currently live close by. They do live close by because I see them walking to the bus stop. I see them walking away from the Kroger. So as the neighborhood continues to skyrocket in price, where do they live?
Yeah.
And I saw this so dramatically impacted when I had a chance to go to Martha's Vineyard a couple of summers ago. The very people that work in the restaurants in Martha's Vineyard have to get on a ferry and drive across the water to go home at night in the dark. So when we start talking about live, work, and play, the people that work, that serve you in the restaurant, that cooking the food and so forth and so on, they can't live, work, and play in the restaurant, but perhaps the restaurant owner can, or somebody else who has a six-figure paying job can. So we have to address this issue of how do we create an opportunity for, in neighborhoods where the values are appreciating, is there a way for home ownership and housing to take place where people who are not making $600,000 can buy a $600,000 home? Is there a way for them to live in the community also?
And I, like you, think that there is. And
your dad does.
Yeah. And I think that it just takes some people thinking outside the box a little bit and reimagining a little bit.
Yeah, and figuring out
Um,
a more creative way to use land
yeah.
and to and probably provide more density on that land, but making sure that every person that occupies every square footage of that space in that community is not, this high income earning person, but it's also inclusive of people who have, different levels of income in terms of
Oh,
what
you
they're
know what's
doing.
interesting, Jeff? I just took a finance class, and this is a little bit of a stretch analogy, but I took a finance class, and one of the core principles you learn is when you have a stock portfolio, your portfolio should be diverse. A bunch of different types of stocks, longing, shorting the stocks, all these, right? I think it's important for a community to be diverse, right? Having different people, different perspectives, different languages, because when you have all these different mindsets, the creativity just flourishes, right? There's different ways that people are going to look at things. There are different ways people are going to interact with one another. And when you're creating a condo that's selling each apartment for what, 300 grand or more, I don't even know. One, the diversification economically is low, and two, the building itself is not supporting a community based living situation, and that's the issue.
Well, you're so right, and that word diversity is so important because a diverse finance portfolio is a healthy finance portfolio.
Exactly.
Okay, and and your dad will tell you one of the things I'm really into is urban gardening. And in order to have an organic garden where you don't use pesticides, you have to have a diverse.
You
You have
can't
to you
have
have to
monoculture.
right. You have to have the diverse group of plants in there
Right.
because that brings the ecological balance needed for that garden.
Yeah.
And I can tell you right now, in order for you to be healthy, you have to eat a diverse diet.
Yeah.
Kale is good for you, but if you only ate kale,
Yeah.
you would die.
Yeah.
Because your body cannot support just eating kale. And so you have to have a combination of vegetables and fruits in order to be healthy. And it goes back to that word that you use, diversity. And I used that word earlier. It's our organization is always focused on diversity and inclusion. So
And
that's what's needed in inclusion.
yeah.
So you have to have diversity and you have to be an inclusive community. And so you have to be open to diversity, ethnic wise. You have to be open to others being included in this economic process here in America.
I'm gonna say one thing in response and then ask you my standard closing question. Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that a lot of people, especially like big businesses right now, right? They think like, oh, diversity, inclusion. I'm gonna hire a token black person, or I'm gonna hire a one Hispanic person and ask them and I'm gonna put them at the head of diversity initiative. But then everyone in the board meeting or 90% of the board meeting is gonna be 90% white, right? Like people need to understand when you say diversity and inclusion, it means diversity and inclusion, right?
Yes.
When you say I'm gonna have a diverse diet, that doesn't mean eating kale every day and then throwing potatoes in for dinner 3 times a week. That's not a diverse diet. That's still eating kale and having a potato here and there. So yeah, that was my response. My closing question that I ask everyone, Jeff, is what can we do, me or the listeners, right? Like I think that just to give you a little bit of an understanding, I'm using Tufts Hillel as a platform, um, and so I'd imagine I don't go through everyone who's watching and look at everyone's ethnicity and background and socioeconomic status, but I'd imagine that most people listening, hopefully to this point, are white Jewish people, or as you said, Jewish people with white privilege, right? And so, what can we do? What can we do, especially right now? Like, how can we, yeah, that's my question. I'm gonna leave it there.
Now, when you say we, are you talking about we in terms of me and you, or we as Jewish?
The viewer,
The viewer?
and
I think
me and
what
the
we can,
viewers.
yeah, I think what we can do is to share information, share our expertise, be willing to teach one another, be
Mm,
willing to help one another economically. If you're a great business person, be willing to help someone that hasn't had the opportunities and access that you have. Be that guy to give them a shot. You
yeah.
know, be that person that shares your relationships, your resources with someone else other than your children. You know, and be willing to step outside your comfort zone and recognize that the more I can do to help expand diversity among all people, we're going to create a much healthier, safer society uh, long term. You know, I wonder what this country would look like if racism did this. You know, what would it really look like if it wasn't so one-sided in terms of um, you know, a different America? You know, what would, you know, if what would it look like? And so I think what we have seen occur is that when we focus on equality and we focus on loving each other and remove, and it's very hard because of the way, because of America, we can remove these social prejudices that we have, you know, these free judgment of other people based upon stereotypes and family opinions and friends and all this other stuff, junk that go on, and get to know a person for who they are and be willing and open to do that. You know, our children, guys like you, my daughter, you know, I got a 14-year-old daughter and 12-year-old son. I want them to live in a, I don't want them to live with the fear I've had to live with of not trusting someone else because they're white.
I think that's a good ending. You have any other words?
Nope, that's it, man. I appreciate the time. I
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
likewise, man. I really appreciate talking. Yeah,
Tell your dad I said hello, man.
yeah. Have a blessed day, man.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.